Well, here we go with Reconstruction. As you can see, Reconstruction takes place in a 12-year period from 1865 to 1877. And the big question is how to best reconstruct the South, because basically the country has been destroyed by the Civil War. So to show you how much it has been destroyed, you look at some of these statistics, and besides the statistics of death, besides the percentage of white male population dead and so on, the big question here is this: what do you do with all of these 4 million now freed African Americans, also known as freedmen? That is a tremendous task. You're talking about 4 million or so people, that most of whom can't read or write because that was made illegal for slaves. But how are you going to educate them and rebuild the South while you're doing this? And there's hardly any government structures left, as you can see, with political and economic disarray. How are we going to rebuild the South? And there's differing opinions about this, as we'll see. Two big questions when we talk about Reconstruction. Number one, what would the fate of the freedmen be after the Civil War? Are they going to get to vote? Are they going to get to take their proper place in society? How are they going to be treated after the war? How are we going to ensure that they have economic opportunities, even political opportunities? Legislation-wise, we'll also talk about the types of legislation passed during Reconstruction. So these are my two big questions when I talk about Reconstruction. Politically speaking, there are 3 different amendments that are passed during Reconstruction, and let's talk about the first one. The 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery, and this is the most important centerpiece of all of the Reconstruction amendments. Basically, this validates what the Civil War was fought for, and this is ratified right away. And one of the reasons it's ratified right away is because the northern governments are the only governments that are actually present in the United States. The southern states are not in the United States anymore because they are currently being reconstructed, and they're not readmitted yet. So this is the first constitutional amendment. Legislatively also, the government passes this law called the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a food distribution service. It distributes food to millions of former slaves. It also tries to educate African Americans by establishing schools staffed by missionaries and teachers. You can see in this picture here, this is a schoolhouse of varying grade levels. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, if you look real close, is you see white kids in it. So this is one of the things that's kind of interesting, that even though this was something that you would think that's basically something to help out freed blacks, it even does its part to help out poor whites. Because I think the prevailing attitude is that you're helping people in poverty. You're helping people get back on their feet. And this is one of those things in American history that applies to all different people that might be downtrodden after the Civil War, especially in the South. It only lasted 1 year because of the cost, and it does cost a lot to educate many African Americans, and maybe even some poor whites too, and distribute food. And therefore, sometimes when you have new administrations and new governments, the funding doesn't last, and so therefore it lasted only 1 year. Southern governments that arose out of the ashes of Reconstruction started to use these laws called black codes to try to keep African Americans in their place. And black codes allowed people in governments in the South to basically authorize anybody who's an authority, local officials, to apprehend unemployed African Americans. So if they're unemployed, in violation of the law. Newly freed blacks who were trying to find a place to live often became vagrants, like they were basically settling on land that might have belonged to somebody else because they didn't really have a home anymore. So it fined them. And so blacks usually didn't have the money because, well, they were slaves, so they didn't have the money to basically pay those fines, and then what would happen is they would be hired out to private employers to satisfy the fine. It's kind of similar to what you see with indentured servitude. What results is it forces many blacks to become what are called sharecroppers. I like to call this slavery light, and I'll tell you why in a second. But sharecropping is a lot of different things. There's two types of sharecropping. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically the idea is that the sharecropper, in order to pay off the debt, would farm part of the owner's land, and at harvest time, each sharecropper would pay the landowner 1/4 to 1/3 of his crop for the use of his land. So basically, what this means is, in order to pay that fine for vagrancy, they're going to farm the land and pay back the landowner of 1/4 to 1/3 of the value of the crop that they yield. The second type of sharecropping was the type in which African Americans only supplied their own labor, and that was pretty awful because they had to then rent the owner's mule and equipment and had to buy seed from the owner. This type of sharecropper normally was given 1/2 of the harvest in autumn. So in both cases, basically, if you look at this word debt peonage, this just basically means that the sharecropper cannot pay off all of the debt and therefore is required by the law to work the owner's fields the next year in order to pay off his debt. So you might be a former slave without any skills that just gets fined by the government for being a vagrant when you have no home, and the only way that you can make money is oftentimes to work for the same people that had you as slaves in the first place. And then when you harvest everything, you have to give up various amounts of the value of your crop, whether it's this much or this much, to the landowner. And oftentimes those landowners were the former masters of those slaves. And this system is not exactly slavery. Again, I call it slavery light because really it's slavery in name in some ways. If you look all over the South, you see a tremendous amount of areas where there are sharecropping going on. Sharecropping in the South takes place throughout the former Cotton Belt, and you can see that the red areas have the most amount of sharecropping, and this is understandable considering this is the Cotton Belt, the Cotton Curtain, as we like to say, and it's no surprise that sharecropping existed in those former places. Another political linchpin of the Reconstruction era is the 14th Amendment, which is also called the Equal Protection Amendment. And this was passed by radical Republicans in 1868 to basically make sure, to combat the Jim Crow laws, to make sure that all former slaves are receiving the same rights and security of freed people. And this is important because this comes up a lot these days when we're talking about the rights of minorities, especially one example is with gay marriage. They're going to bring this up in court to make sure that they're getting their equal rights protected. Anyways, back then, it was something to combat those Jim Crow laws. The 15th Amendment is probably one of the most important ones, and this is the one that gives African Americans the right to vote. As you can see, the text of the bill is right here. But what this does, this has an alternative, ulterior motive by Republican politicians who are in power to make sure that, in some ways, the African Americans vote Republican, to give them the right to vote, because no African American in their right mind back in the day in those days would vote Democratic, because Democrats are the party of segregation and the party of Jim Crow and the party of black coats and the party of the South. So on the surface, this looks like something where African Americans get the right to vote, and it's like justice. Got to tell you though, women's rights groups were totally mad, because they had been picketing and fighting for the right to vote for years and years. So those are the constitutional amendments, some of the political aspects of Reconstruction. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about some of the other aspects of Reconstruction.